Looking back at the major events in world history during the 20th century, it is difficult not to focus our attention on the two world wars, which defined the first half of the century and restructured the world order to this day. In seeking to understand these two terrible conflicts, one of the primary questions which arises is in regard to the connection between them. More specifically, we must ask ourselves, how did World War I, which was known as the War to End All Wars, lay the groundwork for an even more destructive conflict only 2 decades later? To answer that question, it is necessary to turn our attention to the peace treaty, which formally put an end to World War I, a treaty known as the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in 1919 between Germany and the Allied powers, which at that time included the United States, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. In deciding how to handle Germany after the war, there was a significant disagreement between the United States on one side of the Atlantic and its allies such as Britain and France on the European continent. On the one side, Woodrow Wilson wanted to use the treaty after World War I as an opportunity to establish a new peaceful world order based on diplomacy, free trade, and self-determination, a vision which he outlined in his 14 points. While President Wilson supported some manner of war reparations or repayments by Germany in the form of land to France and the newly reconstituted nation of Poland, he was in support of Germany eventually re-establishing itself as an economic and political player in Europe. Britain and France, on the other hand, took a much different approach, seeking to punish Germany and prevent it from posing a future threat to the stability of Europe. As European neighbors to Germany, both France and Britain were far more concerned than President Wilson about the idea of Germany being restored to a position of power and emerging as a military threat. Additionally, Britain and France had both suffered tremendous losses during the war, with cities and factories destroyed and millions of lives lost. Both nations felt they needed to justify the high costs of the war to their suffering citizens, and therefore pushed for extremely harsh punishments on Germany. In the end, Britain and France won out over President Wilson, and the Treaty of Versailles was written as a means to recoup the financial losses that the European allies suffered, as well as a tool to prevent Germany from posing a threat in the future. Now, one of the most important aspects of the Treaty of Versailles was Article 231, known as the War Guilt Clause, which established Germany and its allies as the party responsible for instigating World War I, and therefore responsible for all the damages which it caused. Germany was required to repay huge economic reparations to the Allied nations, while also being forced to disarm, disbanding its armed forces and giving up its military weapons and vehicles. Additionally, Germany was required to give up portions of its territory, such as Alsace-Lorraine on its border with France, as well as its eastern region, to the nation of Poland, which regained its independence after the war in 1918. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany's primary ally during the war, was formally dissolved as a result of the Treaty of Versailles into a number of independent nations, many of which, including Czechoslovakia and Austria, had large German minority populations. Now, to get to the key question, which is this: how did this treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, which was created specifically to hold Germany down and prevent it from posing a threat ever again, produce a situation in which only 2 decades later Germany would invade Poland and set off another and even more destructive global conflict? I want to draw attention to two specific outcomes of the Treaty of Versailles, which laid the groundwork for World War II. The first is that the harsh economic reparations that Germany was forced to pay quickly plunged the nation into an economic crisis in the early years of the 1920s. In order to pay the high reparations costs, the Weimar government, which controlled Germany, began to print money at an unsustainable rate, leading to massive hyperinflation to the point where the German currency, the mark, was essentially useless. And there are striking historical photos, such as these seen here, of Germans in the early 1920s burning piles of money in their furnaces as it had entirely lost its value. As a result of this hyperinflation, the savings of millions of Germans were essentially wiped out overnight, and German society was thrown into disarray. A second major result of the Treaty of Versailles was that a significant population of ethnic Germans who had been living in parts of Germany or the Austro-Hungarian Empire prior to World War I were cut off from Germany. Many Germans, who felt like they had been unjustly accused of single-handedly causing World War I, were enraged as they saw territory largely settled by ethnic Germans, as we can see here on this map, carved away from Germany and handed to nations such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and France. While the Treaty of Versailles was intended to keep Germany from ever again posing a threat to the stability of Europe, instead it produced an economic crisis that threw German society into chaos and led to the suffering of millions of Germans. Additionally, the Treaty of Versailles bred outrage and resentment at what many Germans considered the theft of territory and lands that rightfully belonged to Germany. This environment of suffering and resentment proved to be fertile ground for the angry and impassioned politics of a young Adolf Hitler, who quickly rose to national prominence in the interwar years, writing a message of German superiority, attacking the Treaty of Versailles, and promising to restore Germany to a position of greatness.